Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Joining me today, Professor Bruce Thornton of California State University in Fresno. A classicist, Professor Thornton sees in Europe a civilization that traces back at least 25 centuries. Today, he believes that long story may be drawing to an end. His book, Decline and Fall, Europe's Slow Motion Suicide. Let's start with the cover. Flag of the European Union doing a dissolve and
Brussels
sinking into a drain. Sinking into a drain. Europe down the drain. Explain yourself.
Well, as you know, I didn't design the cover, but I love it. I think it's I think it's great. There are several factors that most people who comment on Europe today identify. There's the economic. In the new globalized economy, European economies aren't as efficient and aren't as adaptable because of state regulation and other factors as certainly as the United States' economy, and then cowboy economies of China and India. They're not really placed to compete as well. Second is the incredibly expensive social welfare entitlements. Europe has extremely generous retirement benefits, sick leave, etc. And as everybody knows, those expenses all are tied to payroll taxes, taxes on the economy. So those two factors interconnect. And then third, of course, is the demographic issue. The Europeans simply aren't reproducing. And again, modern capitalism's greatest resource are human beings. Those are the people that work, who come up with the ideas, who buy the products. It creates issues with labor, etc.
You place special emphasis on the loss of religious belief. From Decline and Fall, let me quote you to yourself. If pride in the nation and belief in its unifying identity are abandoned, weakness or disintegration, or at least weakness of the nation state is against the European Union superstate, right? If the future is a matter of indifference for the childless, you've mentioned that, demographic question, and most important, if traditional Christianity is discarded, what values, ideals, and beliefs will then unify Europeans? Give me a word or two on the sinking of traditional Christianity.
Well, all these problems that I was enumerating, the real issue is, well, why? And then we get to the point, well, the loss of a foundational belief system that created the West in the first place, that created Europe in the first place. You know, when somebody says a certain policy should be pursued, such as equality of income, to me, the practical issues of that aren't interesting. To me, what's interesting is, why would somebody believe that in the first place? To me, everything goes back to foundational belief. So when Christianity begins to disappear, and that's a long, obviously, it starts in the late 18th century, and it's a long process, but as it begins to retreat from the public square, it creates a vacuum. And I'm sure you're familiar with the famous quote of C.K. Chesterton: when a man stops believing in God, he doesn't believe in nothing, he believes in anything. So what we've seen in the last couple of centuries, particularly in Europe, are what I call in the book pseudo-religions, substitutes for Christianity that give us, you know, a sense of meaning and importance and what we should pursue, etc.
Now, at the beginning of the 20th century, Europe is a continent of well-defined nations, check, we've got nation states, of high birth rates, check, we've got no demographic problem, and of both, as best one can tell, informal and certainly official adherence to Christianity. So we check that box. In the century that follows, Europe produces 2 world wars, fascism, communism, the extermination camp, the Gulag. Why shouldn't a modern European look back at the old order and say, no more?
Well, but those conflicts were themselves a consequence of the decline in Christianity and the substitute of political religions. The 19th century had communism, you know, and socialism.
Good, you're coming out swinging. one more kind of introductory question. Beginning of the 20th century, again, Europe accounts for a quarter of the world's population. Through their empires, they're ruling perhaps as much as a third of the remaining, a third or more of the remaining surface of the earth and population. They have all the major, by far the most powerful navy is British. The most important land forces are Russian and German. Today, 7% of the population, of economic importance but not dominant, and of no military importance to us whatsoever. Why should Americans care what happens in Europe?
Well, because they are our cousins, our cultural cousins. They do have political freedom, representative government, and they do represent a powerful economic force in the world, and they should be our ally, and they should be contributing more so that the West can stand united against its threats.
Do you, would you subscribe to the notion that if Europe drifts away, if Europe becomes weak or Islamicized, the temperature in the room goes up for us?
Absolutely.
All right. The tide of faith goes out. You write, quote, Europeans may not have become outright atheists, but their surviving faithful tend to be concentrated among the aged, the rural, and some Eastern European countries, close quote. Again, why should we care? Europe is still democratic. It still has free markets. Why should we care about the particular religious beliefs?
Well, if there wasn't the whole issue of radical Islam and Muslim immigrants who are fecund and reproducing and disaffected and underemployed and ripe for jihadist recruitment, probably we wouldn't care that much. But what are they going to call upon? What spiritual, or if that word's not suitable, what cultural resources are they going to call upon to resist a fanatical faith? If all of their goods are material, right, what material good is worth dying for, and what material good is worth killing for?
So it matters because they're in a clash of values first, and you can't beat something with nothing.
Exactly.
All right, now here's where there are basically two narratives, in my judgment, about the role of Christianity in Europe. First is the Thornton thesis. I'm quoting you. The Christian tradition helped to create all the ideals Europe professes to respect. Human rights, equality, tolerance, separation of church and state, respect for individuals, close quote. Christianity helped to create that. Now, that's one. The other is, let's call it the Voltaire/Christopher Hitchens thesis, which is the opposite.
The Enlightenment thesis.
Which is, it starts during the Renaissance, especially during the Enlightenment. Europe wins its beliefs, its understanding and the importance of human rights, equality, tolerance, and so forth by struggling against oppression and superstition by the church.
Yeah.
Now, how do you refute Voltaire and Christopher Hitchens? And believe me, I want to watch this happen.
Well, that's the dominant Enlightenment narrative that was created by Voltaire and his descendants, and that has become sort of the received wisdom. I don't think historically it holds up to scrutiny. Ortega y Gasset had a wonderful phrase in The Revolt of the Masses, I believe, or excuse me, The Tragic Sense of Life, spiritual parasites. The Enlightenment was parasitic on Christianity. It took over the high value on the individual, for example, and then slowly remove all of the spiritual or religious aspects of that. But that's its historical origins. I think that's an issue that can be settled just by cultural history. And let me be clear about one thing, if I may. I don't subscribe to the thesis that all of these things were created by Christianity. I wrote a book called Greek Ways, How the Greeks Created Western Civilization, and I document that that's the beginning of these, but it is how Christianity pulls those forward into its theology and in its ideology and brings them into Europe, and then they develop.
Okay, so would you, I don't know Strauss well enough to give him a fair representation here, but do you subscribe to the Athens and Jerusalem thesis? All right.
Well, so Athens, Rome, and Jerusalem, the three cities, yeah.
All right, so it's the Greek insistence on rationality, the spiritual insights of Jerusalem, of
That's correct.
Hebrew and then Christian tradition.
That's correct.
All of these interacting in what is then the failing Roman Empire. All right. Can you name, suppose you're a high school student or a college student who's just finished reading Christopher Hitchens or is about to be assigned Voltaire. What can you name a book or two that they ought to read to refute this?
Oh, Christopher Dawson. I mean, he wrote several books in this century that laid this all out. Of course, he's not as well known because he falls outside of the dominant Enlightenment narrative that has affected curriculum and that determines how people think.
Christopher Dawson wrote about 20 books, maybe.
At least.
Which one would you?
Yeah, I'm trying to. There's a reprint, Christianity and something. I don't know.
Oh, right. So
thank goodness for Amazon.
Christopher Dawson. Right. All right. Yeah. All right. Now, take it down one more level. The sea of faith was once too at the full, you know what I'm quoting, and round earth's shore, but now I only hear its melancholy long withdrawing roar. Matthew Arnold published Dover Beach in 1867. So the tide of faith has been going out, and of course it starts in the Enlightenment. It's an 18th century phenomenon that begins there. The tide of faith has been going out for a long, long time. Why? Answer that question.
Well, there's a lot of reasons for that. One has been, I think, the incredible success of modern science in altering the material world and improving people's lives materially, because that you can't ignore.
It works.
It works, and the material is more immediate to us than the spiritual, right? It's easier to grasp. And that success, I think, made it easier for people to start, shrinking the role of the spiritual. Now, other obvious influences, Darwin, Marx, all of the determinisms, materialist-based determinisms that begin to sort of chip away at spiritual belief. I think that's one big reason why this happens.
All right, I'll come back to this in a moment, but what we have then is a phenomenon that's been going on for at least 2 centuries with very deep cultural and intellectual roots. So put one portion of your brain at work on the question, how do we reverse that? And we'll come back to that in a moment. The decline of Christianity, the decline of the nation state. You write, again, quote, a factor that could fuel a hyper-nationalist revival. You're writing about the kind of thing that, of course, the great example here is Nazi Germany, that could fuel a hyper-nationalist revival is the animus against genuine patriotic sentiment that characterizes the jet-setting post-national EU elites, close quote. All right, there's a lot going on in that sentence. Let's just pause for a moment and take that one. That's our text for a moment or two here. Distinguish between hyper-nationalism and genuine patriotic sentiment.
Well, mystic nationalism, I think, is another way of putting it, which is one of the roots of fascism, a kind of blood and soil attitude towards the nation as tied to a certain ethnic group and blood, which is exclusive, right? As opposed to a genuine and sincere pride in one's own way, because it is one's own and because it's worthy of your admiration and your defense, but it is open and is not predicated on any kind of ethnic determinism. I think that's the distinction. But if a patriotism is denigrated and is not given, respect, it's possible that it could sort of evolve into that other as a reaction.
And part of your thesis here in Decline and Fall is that the European Union super state is what? Doing what? Undermining the old nation state of England and France and Germany.
Absolutely. I mean, the whole idea was that the horrors of the 20th century were because of nationalism, because of particularism. And the Enlightenment universalism is a superior way of organizing peoples, implying that nationalism is some sort of atavistic or like religion, a superstition that people need to grow out of, instead, relying on the transnational institutions of the EU or such organizations to resolve disputes. But this assumes or implies that nationalist sentiment, that is your affection for your own, for the people who live like you, who believe like you do, is either reprehensible or something that can just disappear rather than being a deep-seated need that people have, and a good one.
Good. All right. Now, since you're a classicist, you start with the Greeks, and when Europe is in some ways at its cultural and intellectual zenith, it's Christendom. It's not Germany and France and England. Right. It's Christendom. It's something that precedes the nation state. So Rome falls, there's the Holy Roman Empire, there's a sense of culture, everybody speaks Latin, there's a shared sense of learning, a shared sense of, frankly, religious and spiritual enterprise centered in Rome. We know that the Holy Roman Empire from Charlemagne, and it sputters along and gets put back together and falls apart and gets put back together. That's a kind of recurring European dream to put it back together.
Right.
Napoleon, I've heard I'm no great fan of Napoleon myself, but I've heard Frenchmen who love him argue that Napoleon's fundamental impulse was to reestablish a unified Europe. So if when Europe was at its zenith, it was Europe, not nation states, why is that not a valid dream? Why shouldn't they be trying to edge their way back toward that?
But at that point, it also wasn't democratic. I mean, it took the nation state to create the conditions for parliamentary sort of government and democratic regimes, political freedom. And so it was the nation state, was the community that fostered those developments. It wasn't going to happen in the feudal aristocratic based.
So your objection to Brussels today is that it's a bureaucratic superstate.
Exactly.
That it's muffling the wishes of the people, which through long tradition, hard-won political and constitutional victories. In England, I suppose, the mother of parliaments would be the leading example. That representative democracy does not have a place at the level of the superstate.
Absolutely.
Well, now, is there a way of, so is your objection, what I'm trying to get to here is, what is your objection with the European Union? Is it some sort of deep cultural objection, or is it merely a matter of institutional arrangements? If they produced a constitution whereby there really were a European Parliament that was popularly elected in a way we could figure out, whether it's by country or by region, but there might be a way of satisfying you. Is that right or not?
Well, I'm not sure, because look at the variety and the diversity of the peoples of Europe and the languages. I mean, it's counter to reality is my biggest objection. It's the old Enlightenment ideal of an abstract super elite of guardians that Plato dreamed about in the Republic.
These are the jet-setting, post-national AU elites.
Right. For a certain stratum, it works wonderfully. They can buzz around here and there, but average people are rooted in a community, right? It's the local. It's not the abstract.
You're pulling Aristotle versus Plato on me right now, aren't you?
Absolutely.
There's a little Karl Popper working in here?
Absolutely.
Okay. So the EU, go ahead and pursue that for a minute. The EU is Platonic.
Well, it's abstract, let's say. I mean, it works in terms of abstract rules. It's totalizing, if not totalitarian, because it will suck in more and more regulatory power, because the more variety you have, the more power you have to smooth differences in variety out. So it works against particularity, against the local, and that necessarily, as we've seen, will work against freedom.
Okay.
That's, I think, the main objection. And it's just not going to work.
And it ain't going to work.
Just on the practical level, I don't think it's going to work.
Demographic suicide. You write a lot about the Muslim immigration to Europe, but first, the antecedent problem, which is the hollowing out of Europe by sheer infertility. I Googled around yesterday, and as best I can tell, there is only one exception to the following rule. Every nation in Europe, every non-Muslim population in every nation in Europe has a birth rate below replacement levels, and the only exception is Malta. All right, so the question is, why are Europeans so insistently declining to reproduce?
Well, that's an interesting question. Children are expensive. Children require that you sacrifice your time and your interests and your own comfort. Children are an investment in the future. If you have, what I call
Europe is richer than it's ever been, though, so that presumably if children were a luxury good, there'd be more, right?
But they are, a detriment to the enjoyment of life now. The Dolce Vita lifestyle does not include children, right? If your highest good is pleasure, if your highest good is a sophisticated life, then children get in the way of all of that. If you're indifferent to the future because you think when you die that's it, there's nothing more anyway, then why would you invest in the future in children? Why would you spend so much money, so much energy, so much psychic energy, right, in children if the highest good is simply material goods? And I think that's the sort of spiritual dimension of the problem.
So the loss of faith or belief leads to is replaced by something as shallow as mere materialism, pleasure. Children are a pain, no matter how much money you have. Well, within certain limits, if you can fob them all off on nannies, I suppose. But changing diapers is unpleasant work.
Absolutely.
So you have few children or no children. And that in turn means that you're not thinking, it's really children who link us to the longer perspective that gets people thinking beyond their own lifetime about the health of the nation,
the community.
The community.
Right.
Got it.
What you owe to the larger community.
So the infertility in Europe is is actually horrifying for what it says about the European set of values
think
today,
so.
let alone what it suggests about the future.
I think, now see, this is different from Russia. There's a lot of reasons why Russia is, it's even worse in terms of its fertility rate, but they have, you know, all sorts of other issues that make it more understandable.
Such as?
Well, they, you know, the economic dislocation.
They've been through a rough time.
Yeah, they've been through a very hard time.
But the Italians haven't. The Italians, since the end of the Second World War, have been, and the French have not, and the British have not.
No, I think it's just a consequence of affluence.
Immigration. Europe's evolution, you quote the scholar Bat Yor, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Correct, yeah.
Europe's evolution from a Judeo-Christian civilization into a post-Judeo-Christian civilization that is subservient to the ideology of jihad and the Islamic powers that propagate it, close quote. You have large numbers of Muslims immigrating into Europe, but isn't that a little alarmist? They're not all jihadists. In other words, what's the problem here?
Well, how do we know? I mean...
Well, for example, the Turks in Germany, they're pretty well assimilated to modernity, if not to German life, wouldn't you say?
The premier of Turkey just made a trip to Germany and said that assimilation to German culture was a crime against humanity for Turks. I'm not sure they are.
I withdraw my suggestion.
You have enclaves all across Europe in which there are non-permeable borders between many of these communities and the larger world in which they live, and in which they feel little loyalty to those values, to the notions of tolerance, political freedom, free speech, etc. And when those quintessential European values, Western values, are challenged by people who are living in Europe, benefiting from its prosperity, its freedom, and you look at Europe's reaction, I mean, it's amazing. You know, you had the cartoon controversy. Now you have a parliamentarian in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders, I think, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, who has made a film critical of Islam, and the government of the Netherlands is meeting with the Islamic Council in a way of saying, well, how do we, you know, how do we deal with this? Instead of saying, hey, tough, you know, this is the West, we have free speech, right? And that willingness to, kowtow, it seems to me, right, sends a signal that, you know what, we have all of these ideals that we say we believe in, but we don't really believe in them because we will trim and we will compromise them at the first threat.
Can I want to go back one more moment to this demographic problem. Mark Stein points out that if you have a country with a population, 90% of which has a birth rate of about 1, and 10% of which has a birth rate of about 3, then the populations become 50-50 within just 2 generations, and that is an accurate description of France today. So even without the immigration about which you write what you write, there's...
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Question. Immigration aside, and as I say, you write about that at great length, but is it right, is it likely to be the case that the Muslim population of Europe reproduces at this higher rate, even as through 2 generations? I keep going back, but isn't the Turkish population in Germany, hasn't that reproduction rate?
There's a valid point that over time, over generations, Muslim reproduction rates begin to lower.
Right.
But you still have the snake and the python, or excuse me, the mouse and the python. You still have this demographic bulge moving through over a course of decades.
Right.
And what can happen as it moves? Just look at the baby boomers in this country and the impact that the boomers have had on this country as they move through time.
Right.
So, you know, that may be in 100 years, but a lot can happen between now and then.
Now, you write about something in the book that was new to me, and that is the dream of El Andalus. That is that, so would you just comment on that? First of all, tell us what the dream is, and then go ahead and debunk it as you do so robustly.
It's a 19th century myth that was actually, as I believe...
But it's still current today.
Oh, absolutely.
Right? All right.
It was started by many Jews to sort of chastise growing anti-Semitism in Europe by saying, look, the Muslims treated us better in Andalus.
Muslims occupy the Iberian Peninsula for about 700 years. And the notion is that life was pretty good there,
Right.
and that it was an open, cosmopolitan kind of
Right.
society. Christians lived there, Jews lived there, and it was
Right.
and
Yeah,
fear not,
yeah,
because
yeah,
that's
yeah,
that's the Muslim world of the future.
Yeah.
And you say
No,
no way.
no, of course that's historically false.
It
I
is.
mean, there were brief moments when Jewish scholars, even Jewish viziers or whatever, could have some sort of influence. But in 1066, 5,000 Jews were massacred in Grenada. You know, the analogy that I use.
You point out, which I didn't know, that Maimonides, who's one of the great Jewish scholars of all the
Right.
centuries, was a refugee from
Spain.
Andalusia.
Yeah.
Al-Andalus, sorry.
The analogy I use is with the Jim Crow South. Now, you can go back and look at black culture in the South from 1900 to 1960, and you can find poets, and you can find business owners, and you can find people getting college degrees. Nobody, based
nobody
on
wants
that,
to go back
would
there.
go back and say, oh, it was a wonderful... And in fact, the old segregationists used to make that argument. I can remember them making it. Right?
Okay. Now we come to the section where we talk about what is to be done. Let me ask first about a couple of historic American policies, and then ask if they were mistakes. From at least the administration of Dwight Eisenhower, it has been official American policy to encourage the political union of Europe. We have been officially
Absolutely.
among the European Union's biggest fans.
That's correct.
Terrible mistake?
Well, not at the time. I mean, at the time, we're in a Cold War.
Right.
And there's, a unified Europe is a better ally. You have France and Italy, strong communist parties in France and Italy. That represents the possibility that Europe could slowly,
Right.
be lost to the democratic camp. But a unified Europe would be a stronger Europe. So I think it made sense at the time.
But we need to adjust.
Well,
what about
yeah.
NATO?
Yeah.
As long ago as the 1980s, Irving Kristol used to say, wait a moment, it made sense for us to be defending Europe after the war when they were still getting back on their feet. But per capita in the 1980s, I can't remember, but his general argument was they're fine now. They're at least as wealthy as the United States now.
Yeah.
They should be shouldering more of their burden.
Absolutely.
And why? Not purely for economic reasons. Irving Kristol would warn a quarter of a century ago that we were going to infantilize the Europeans. We were going to make them incapable of facing reality and dependent on us. And it sounds to me as though that's part of the
Absolutely.
thesis right here.
Absolutely.
So NATO was a mistake.
Well, I think now it's outlived its usefulness.
So why do we have 50,000 troops in Germany even now?
I don't know.
This is ridiculous on the face of it.
I think so. I think that we need some tough love with Europe. I mean, Europe, the
Okay,
EU,
tell me what the United States should do if there's
EU
anything that can be
okay.
done.
The EU says it's not a bipolar world anymore. It's a multipolar world. And we're one of the major poles because of our population, of our wealth, et cetera,
Right.
our influence. Okay, but look, guys, the only thing that makes you significant in global politics is the military. Bottom line, your ability to project force to work your will. Now, the disaster in the 90s in the Balkans exposed the pathetic weakness.
Should we
of
have
the
refused to
EU.
go in and force the Europeans to deal with that mess on their own?
I think there's a good argument to be made for that.
What about Kosovo today? Kosovo today has a 90% Albanian ethnic population,
Muslim.
a Muslim population. The Serbs have historic claims to Kosovo. It's a mess, and that population has just declared independence.
Right.
And we and the British and the French, the Germans, I think, recognized this new country within 48 hours or so. It is utterly defenseless
Absolutely.
against the Serbs.
Absolutely.
Should we say to the Europeans, okay, fine, you take care of that problem?
Well, let's say that the Russians begin to mass some divisions on the border.
Right.
At that point, would say, okay, boys, time to step up to the plate. You know what I mean?
To the Germans and the French.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because they're a free rider on NATO. Let's be clear. They are a free rider. We pretend that NATO is this alliance where everybody... The United States provides the vast bulk of everything that makes NATO work. And at some point, we need to say, if you want this to continue, the contributions have to be equal. Look at in Afghanistan now. The NATO troops from Germany, they don't want to put them in harm's way. And the Canadians are like, hey, wait a minute,
The Canadians are taking
exactly.
heavy casualties, right?
Exactly.
Right.
It's like everybody contributes equally, and we're letting them have a free right. Let me make another point I think that's important. If we have a globalized world, which we do, no question, a globalized economy, there has to be a policeman, right? Somebody has to make sure that transports can sail the seas,
right.
and who's going to play that role? Right now, the United States is playing that role. Europe is a free rider on that, right? They benefit from our
Right.
security that we
Right.
provide.
Right.
And so it's time to say we all have to contribute. We all have to provide the weapons, spend the money on battleships, on all of that sort of material for this to work.
Digging around here, this question, you mentioned that the Canadians are actually putting their troops in harm's way, and I believe for the last couple of months the Canadians are taking more casualties per capita even than we are in Afghanistan. Okay. Question. Is what you've been talking about in decline and fall predominantly a continental European phenomenon? And should the United States be scrambling right now to put together some kind of set of relationships and what's you see this written about is the Anglosphere,
Absolutely.
the English-speaking world. The Canadians are solid, relatively
Australians,
speaking.
relatively.
The Australians, the British, the Indians. It's not an ethnic matter.
No.
Somehow or other, it's the culture, the political culture, and the attitude toward free markets, democracy that somehow or other got transmitted with the English language. Does that make sense to you?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. But here's what I would say. I think that we should not be committed to permanent alliances anywhere. I see no reason for that. I mean, historically, what are the reasons for that? I think that's a holdover from early 19th century balance of power sorts of thinking. I think now we need to. I would say India is an important, the world's largest democracy, has problems, but compared to Pakistan, Mexico right on our border. I mean, I think we need to be doing much more there. And to say to Europe, you guys are rich, you want to be a big, important player.
And you're on your own.
Spend the money on the military, and,
Okay.
and then we'll deal with it.
Last question about American policy with regard to Europe. Considered in light of Europe, does the war in Iraq become more important? That is to say, I have no idea, we've never discussed this, and you don't talk about whether it was right or not to go into Iraq, so this is a real flyer of a question here. But the Bush plan from the outset, which has run into a few obstacles, needless to say, was to create a more or less democratic, functioning government with more or less free markets. If you manage to achieve, if they themselves manage to achieve economic growth in the Arab, in the Muslim world, that takes the pressure off on immigration to Europe. If there is an example of a genuine democracy, that again takes some of the pressure off this dream of recapturing, of rebuilding a caliphate or Al-Andalus. Does it have that? How does it play into Europe? Or not at all?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think for 14 centuries there has been a collision of Islam and what used to be Christendom. And it didn't stop until 1683, and then Islam began to retreat. What we've been seeing starting in the early 20th century after World War I and the loss of the caliphate has been various attempts to reverse that tide and to push back against it. And it's not a question of material goods. It's not a question of, we want more internet service or we want more porn channels. Again, we're back to where we started with the attempt to negotiate spiritual goods in exchange for material ones, and that never works.
Let me name a few names. You give me one sentence on whether each of these people makes you feel more optimistic or less so about Europe. German Chancellor Angela Merkel.
Less optimistic. She's had 2 years and has accomplished nothing that she set out to do in terms of, just in the economic sphere.
Okay. Spanish Prime Minister José Luis Zapatero.
Depressingly pessimistic.
I'm hoping to find a little uptick here. French President Nicolas Sarkozy.
A little bit more optimistic, but again, the obstacles in making these changes are so great that he's not going to be able to, I think, do anything significant. He's already dropped in popularity so much.
Pope Benedict XVI.
The one figure, I think, in Europe that makes you feel some optimism, although the news that he's going to sit down with the Muslims is kind of depressing.
He did sit down with the Muslims. I have some.
Yeah.
This is from yesterday. They announced at the Vatican. Excuse me, he did not himself yet, but there was some sort of official event at the Vatican saying that there's going to be the establishment of a Catholic-Muslim forum, which the Pope will get around to addressing.
Right.
Now, why is it that you said Nicolas Sarkozy? It's impossible for him to make any change. He's the president of the Fifth Republic, but the Pope can make. Why does the Pope encourage you? What has he got at his disposal?
Because he has seen in his works and his writing, as did John Paul II, both have seen the spiritual crisis that lies at the heart of the European crisis. And they are talking about that, and nobody else wants to talk about that because we're all Voltaire, we're all rationalists, we're all just
so
gonna talk
contra
about
Christopher
material.
Hitchens, if you want to ask who is the greatest realist, not fabulist, but realist in Europe today, you would knock on those big bronze doors
Absolutely.
at the papal apartments.
Absolutely.
All right, last question, Bruce. If you could give the next president of the United States one, two at the most, sentences of instruction about what to do concerning Europe, what would you say?
Well, we've already said it. Sit down and renegotiate NATO and renegotiate any sorts of mutual defense treaties in which we foot all of the bill and they don't. Show some tough love. Make them start putting their money where their mouth is if they want to be a big boy in global politics.
Bruce Thornton, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bruce Thornton's book, Decline and Fall, Europe's Slow Motion Suicide. I'm Peter Robinson at the Hoover Institution for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.